You enlisted in the Army in 1964. What was your motivation to go into the Army?
I just figured that they were drafting people at that time, so that was a big motivation. And then because you didn't just want to be drafted and stuck in somewhere, so I wanted to do what I wanted to do, so I volunteered.
You volunteered. And um, 64, that's early when we're talking about the Vietnam conflict. When you enlisted in the Army, were you even really aware at that time that something was brewing over in Vietnam?
Oh yeah, it was particularly when we got in the army, we knew that there was problems over there, and
Yeah.
and so that's where I ended up.
What was your job in Vietnam?
Rifleman. Uh, I was a fire team leader. I, it's funny because you have a platoon, and the platoon has a platoon leader, and the platoon leader he kept me on the point all the time, and I had different people rotate with me, uh, as a point, but you have a the point person, what I would do is I'd have a guy in front of me. I had a guy named Golia, and then I can't even remember the other guy's name right now, but I'd put Golia in front of me, and I'd be in the middle, and I'd have the other guy behind me. And then the platoon leader, he would be uh, with, he'd have a couple guys in front of him, and then he would be there, and they would be say, "Okay, blessing, hold up," or whatever they need to do to keep me so I didn't get too far ahead of them. You'd get on the helicopter and you'd air assault in, and uh, the army was very, they didn't want to put their helicopters in harm's way, but of course they had to from time to time. And I can remember a few times you'd actually hear bullets hitting the helicopter as you were landing, and that was pretty scary, I'll tell you. But I don't remember anyone ever being hit and actually because you're in one helicopter, and usually they'd have a big assault team, uh, probably at least 30 helicopters, and you'd come in all 30 at the same time, and then you'd spread out and if you we tried not to come in under fire, but a few times, we did have to do that. And, you could actually, I'll never forget this one assault we did, and you could hear the bullets hitting the helicopter. They make a smack, kind of sound. And so that was a scary one. That was probably the worst one I was ever on. Sometimes they'd take us by truck, or they would, uh, when we went to the coast, that one, um, it was all trucks, and we were just filled with the army trucks, big old army trucks, they were, and there'd be about 20 guys in each truck in the back of it, and then you didn't sit down, you stood around the truck with your rifle ready and everything else, because we never knew when we were going to get hit. But that one when we went from An to Bong Song, uh, that that was a really they had uh, uh, the whole road, which it was I can't remember how far it was, but it was quite a ways, and from An, and we went by truck, and they had guards all along the road, protecting the caravan, you know. The platoon leader, he knew that I didn't mind walking point, and the platoon leader, he loved me. You know, he would say, "Okay, Blessing, take the point," you know, and
Wow.
I'd get my two guys and go.
Now, a lot of soldiers though hated walking point.
Yeah,
Why didn't you mind it? Why was your perspective different?
you know, I had a my thought was that I could do something maybe better than a lot of those guys, you know, in our platoon. That so I always, if you know, if the platoon leader today says, "Blessing, you take the point," and I say, "Yeah, I'll take the point," you know. So I felt that I could maybe, you know, react a little better than a lot of the guys.
You had some color blindness, and you felt
Yeah,
that that gave you an advantage
yeah,
in Vietnam. What
yeah.
was the advantage that having some color blindness gave you?
You know, it's just that I could see things that other people couldn't see. And particularly, you know, when you were in the forest and whatnot, you know, I had for some reason, my colorblindness caused me to be able to see better than I'd say, oh, there's something there, you know,
Wow.
and uh, and they'd go, where, you know, so
So, for example, if just an example I'm coming up with, if there are Viet Cong in the kind of the traditional, black pajamas, as we call them, um, in the foliage, you might be able to spot them a little bit quicker because in that case, your color blindness gave you a little bit of an
yeah,
advantage.
yeah, I could. They quite often I say, "Oh, hold it," you know, and I said, "There's something there," and everyone would be going, where," you know, and but I was very fortunate, and the platoon leader he wanted he kept me in point most of the time, you know. They'd break me, you know, they'd you know let me uh, put someone else on point for a while. But because it was that was a dangerous spot to be, because if you bumped into them, quite often they would open fire on you, and the theory was that they would take a few shots at you and then run like hell, you know. So we would try and chase them down, but you know they knew the areas so much better than we did that uh, we didn't we usually didn't chase them very far. If we did, as soon as they were out of sight, we'd leave them alone, you know.
It sounds like you're talking primarily about the Viet Cong and less the NVAs. Is that right? When you're talking about
Yeah,
the enemy that
yeah, the
takes shots and then run?
yeah, yeah, the VC is that's we bumped up against the VC a lot more than the MVA, because the MVA they um they were, you know, hardcore soldiers and whatnot, whereas the other ones were just, you know, like they would come in and out of combat. You know, they would disappear, and then the next thing you knew, they were in taking snapshots at you. You know,
Yeah.
so
Well, so yeah, I wanted to ask you about your perception of the Viet Cong and the NBA, and I think you kind of just answered the question, but as a combatant yourself, and you saw a lot of combat, you experienced a lot of combat. As a combatant, what was your assessment of the Viet Cong? What was your assessment of the NVA as combatants?
oh yeah, well the NBA were really hardcore. You know, we knew that, and we would bump up against you know both of them. You know, sometimes the NBA and sometimes not.
In your memoir, a number of times you mentioned operations with Arvin troops. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering what your perception of the Arvin troops was. So these are the South Vietnamese forces allied with the Americans. What
Yeah,
was your assessment of the Arvin forces?
they were not really well trained, the Arvin, and so they would do things that they really probably shouldn't have done, and get themselves into trouble. And a lot of times we had to bail them out. That we would sometimes have to go in and relieve them from a position they got themselves in that was not a good position. So yeah, they we that didn't happen too often, but it did and every once in a while we'd end up having to bail them out.
So it sounds like the perception of the Arvins is that they weren't necessarily the most reliable ally if a serious fight broke out.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. They tend, there were cases there, and I don't think that ever happened with me or us, my unit, but sometimes they would break and run. And I mean, they were known to do that. If things got really hot, they would, you know, disappear. And then if it was the American unit with them, then the American unit had to take over and take care of business.
You also, in your memoir, a number of times mentioned ROK forces, Republic of Korea, so South Korean
Yeah,
forces. What
yeah.
reputation did the ROK forces have?
Oh, they had a very good reputation. They were really tough soldiers, and they were just as good as us. And we did work with them a few times. There's so many things that I had in my head in those days because, you had to be thinking all the time, what's going to happen? What do we do if it does happen? And where do we go? Or how do we keep ourselves alive?
Sure.
'Cause basically that's what we tried to do. We tried to keep ourselves without being injured. So that was tough to do. You never knew what was going to happen, and we got ambushed a few times, and we were real fortunate that they would usually, if the VC especially, if they tried to ambush you, they would take a few shots and then run. And so they,
Yeah.
they usually didn't do too good ambushes, but the MVA, they were tough soldiers, and if they ambushed you, you were in big trouble. So, but you just had to go with the flow.
In addition to the enemy, so obviously dealing with Viet Cong and the NVA, obviously that's a major stress. It's, something that's stressful in South Vietnam, knowing that the enemy are out there trying to ambush you. What other things did soldiers in the field in South Vietnam have to deal with that was stressful? For example, um, fire ants, I know are out there.
Oh yeah,
What
yeah.
other kinds of things did you have to deal with that just made, you know, living in the bush in Vietnam such a challenge?
Yeah, well, there were snakes. We'd come across them, and they had those huge python, I think they are, big, huge snakes. And then they had all different kinds of unfriendly animals in Vietnam. So you had to be alert all the time,
Like,
even when the enemy wasn't around.
right. Leeches? Were there leeches?
Oh yeah, leeches. In fact, we would that's a funny thing. A leech, when it gets on you, you sometimes can't feel it. And so we'd be going through, and it's dripping rain all the time. Not all the time, but I mean it rained a lot, and we would be going through the jungle, and we'd be soaking wet and whatnot. And then all of a sudden someone would yell, "Oh, leeches!" and you'd start looking all over your body if you found had any on you, you know.
So you've got the ants, you've got the snakes, you've got the leeches, and then you just mentioned it's raining all the time, or it's raining a lot, especially at certain
Yeah.
times of the year. But one of the things I've heard from veterans in Vietnam is that you're always wet. Either you're getting
Yeah.
rained on or you're sweating, but you're wet
Yeah.
all the time. Is that right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. We stayed wet pretty much all the time, you know, because you know, as you're walking and traveling in the trails and whatnot, uh, you know, you just you work up a sweat, you know, and it's just part of the deal there. So we were constantly um, pretty much wet
And that's
almost all the time. Yeah.
and that's related to yet another challenge, which would be the intense heat and humidity of South.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was the humidity was terrible, you know.
How about mosquitoes?
Yeah, plenty of mosquitoes. They were around, but we had mosquito repellent that we used, you know. So that it did help a lot of keeping mosquitoes off of us. But you know, we'd run out of that sometimes, and then you just had to you smelt the mosquitoes as you'd find them. But of course, we kept, you know, we usually kept our sleeves down, but sometimes we put them up like to our elbow or something, and so you had to be careful then that you didn't get a mosquito on you, and they'd start drilling on in you, you know.
My understanding is that out of your platoon, only six came out of the Battle of Bangsan on without wounds or without being killed in action, and you were one of
Yeah.
six. Is that
I
right?
was one of them. Yeah, I was one of them. I can't even hardly remember how I put that, but yeah, there was a few. The platoon had about 30, and so that showed how many guys were wounded. And we didn't have too many killed in that battle, believe it or not. But we took a lot of wounded, you know,
Yeah.
and there was just a few of us left.
You go into Bangsan a number of times, but for in what becomes this major battle, May 6, 1966, you
Yeah,
write that this was one of the few hot LZs that you flew into. In other words, one of the few hot landing zones, meaning that the helos are landing under fire.
yeah,
Um, if you put yourself back in that moment, you're on that helo, and now you're stepping off the helo, and it's a hot landing zone. What images come to your mind? What do you remember about that moment when you stepped into this hot landing zone, May
yeah.
66?
Well, that I was on an outside helicopter. You know, we were landing about oh geez, I think maybe a group of 20 at a time, and the um, when you land like that, you 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 got to be careful because if someone's behind you and decide they want to shoot, you could be in just the wrong place at the wrong time. But that particular there, I still have pretty good memory of that one, and we really had a mess there, and uh, the MVA we were up against the MVA, and it was interesting that the NBA, even though they were, you know, good fighters, good shots, they were about as good as we were, but they uh, they did turn and run, you know, occasionally, and just to get out of our way, you know.
Now, one of the things that you mention a number of times in your memoir, and I believe you mention it when you write about the Battle of Bong Son. And you hear about this from veterans who are in Vietnam pretty early, using the M16, the switch from the M14 to the M16. And the
Yeah,
problem with that weapon, this weapon is jamming all of the time. Was
yeah.
was that a problem for you, your M16 jamming?
Yeah, we did figure out some ways of keeping it from jamming, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I remember we came up with a solution that helped. And the one of the things was instead of putting it on full automatic, where you just hold the trigger down and it shoots, we uh, have it on a single shot, so you had to pull the trigger each time, and that seemed to help the jamming quite a bit, as I remember.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're using your M16 and it jams on you, that
Mhm.
probably means that you're in a combat situation.
Oh
So
yeah,
yeah, this weapon is jamming at the worst possible time.
yeah.
Um, I mean, so one of the things I wonder is, and I think you mentioned this in the memoir, I've I've heard, some soldiers and Marines say that the M16 was so unreliable that they would look for some other weapon, even using AK-47s. Others say, well, you couldn't use the AK because if you couldn't use the AK-47 because if Marines, U.S. Marine soldiers heard that, they would assume that it's Viet Cong. So you're in this tough
Yeah.
situation. But do you remember those kinds of discussions? Like, we've got to find some other weapon to use because this M16 is not reliable.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I carried it the whole time I was in the field. I had a M16, and you know you could clear it pretty quickly. That was one advantage. If you got a jam in there, you could clear it. Pop the jam out, and then open fire again. But that was one advantage to it. It was um, uh, easy to unjam it when it did get jammed. But I don't know. It was a scary thing to have that knowing that sometimes it wasn't real reliable. So we worried about it, but
Yeah.
we tried to keep them in the best shape as we could and keep them clean and try to I actually stopped using the full automatic. I started using just a single shot just because full automatic, that was one of the things that it would jam on when you pull it and shoot a burst and it would jam sometimes on doing that. And so I stuck to mine of keeping it on single shot, and then that way I knew it probably was going to shoot.
Do you have any recollections of soldiers, wanting to use the AK-47, a captured AK-47, or some other weapon to avoid using the
Oh,
M16?
oh yeah, we had a few people that they would use them. We didn't have too many, but we had a few.
What happened to Freddie Camp?
Yeah, well, that one I remember because I was hearing the radio for the platoon sergeant, and they there was a stream, and they had taken a big log, about a, a really big size log, and then they had put it down across the stream to cross, and one of our platoons went uh, across that log. And then I was there with this Freddie Kemp, and he he had just come in to the company. He had caught up with the our our unit, and so I was over there because the platoon sergeant was over and he was talking to, they had a mortar set up on our side of the creek. It wasn't a real big creek, but it was maybe 8 or 10 feet wide. And so anyway, I had been there because of platoon my I was carrying the radio for the platoon sergeant, and he had said, "Hey," he says, "I'm going to go across the log here, and I'm going to go talk to the captain." And so off he went, you know. So I'm standing there by the log, and here's this Freddie Kemp, and he comes up and he says, "Oh," he says, "boy," he says, "that log looks slippery," you know. And so we started talking back and forth, you know. I said, "Yeah," I said, "Are you going across?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I got to go across." I said, "Hey," I said, just hang back here, you know, they got a whole, you know, they got 50 guys out there, you know, they're not in any hurt for people." And he said, "Oh," he says, I better go across." And so they had a rope going across, and then they had the log, and you'd hang on to the rope and just slide along the rope. And then that way, if you did slip, you could, hang on to that rope
Yeah.
and maybe not go in the water. So anyway, he finally said, "Well," he says, I'm gonna go." And so he got up on the log and he started across and he stopped right in the middle. And I'm going, "Hey," I says, "don't stop." I said, "You're going good. Just keep one foot at a time right in front of you." And I said, That'll, you'll be fine, you know." And so, I don't know why, well, I knew better than to try and get up there and help him,
Yeah.
because he could take you right in with it, take you in with him when he went, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's what happened. He slipped on the log, he grabbed the rope, and he hung on to it for about 10 seconds, and then he lost his grip, and it went into the creek, you know. And that's never he the and the creek was flowing pretty strong, so he went with the creek, and I don't think we ever did find his body. I don't remember if we did or not, but we did look for it. We went downstream, and see if we could find him.
Sometimes veterans say that they have recurring dreams, that there's a dream they have over and over again, related to their combat service. Is that true for you? Did you find over the years that you had a dream that you had over and over again?
Well, it took a few years for me to kind of lay everything behind me. But yeah, for a while there, I was having, uh, they were pretty much nightmares, So, and then quite often I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I go, "Oh, geez, what did I dream now?" And quite often I didn't remember the dreams, but I just knew that I was dreaming. And so I
Is
don't know. It was kind of a crazy time right then too for me.